Good evening. My name is Jocelyn Wu, and it's my pleasure to greet you on behalf of all those involved in the creation and execution of this weekend. This is Global Health Conference Midwest 2015. This evening, I'm joined by my two co-directors, John Campbell and Alicia Rainwater. This is the 7th Global Health Conference Midwest. John, Alicia, and I are second-year medical students at Creighton, and I'm excited to share that this conference is the first year that Global Health Conference Midwest has been hosted at our university. Our program has been selected diligently in hopes of emphasizing learning, collaboration, advocacy, and interprofessionalism. We hope that you will enjoy this weekend and feel empowered to approach our theme, Changing Perspectives in Global Health. I am honored to introduce the Provost of Creighton University, who will be opening our conference, Dr. Edward O'Connor. Please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you, Jocelyn, and to the organizers of this event. First, let me welcome all of you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us at our regional conference for global health interest in the Midwest, being hosted by Creighton for the first time. As Jocelyn mentioned, my name is Dr. Edward O'Connor. I serve as the Provost and Chief Academic Officer for Creighton University. And on behalf of the university and the School of Medicine, we are honored to host the conference in collaboration with the University of Nebraska Medical Center and its various partners and donors involved in the event. This conference is an opportunity for professionals, faculty, and students to connect, collaborate, and learn about pertinent and emerging topics in global health. I'd like to welcome all medical and health profession students from across the Midwest and everyone else who is joining us here today and this weekend. Themed Changing Perspectives in Global Health, this conference will foster your talents and you'll form a network with individuals who share similar goals. Individuals who believe in raising awareness by engaging individuals and communicate through advocacy, education, and service. You'll have the opportunity to discuss potential solutions for various issues affecting vulnerable populations, both nationally and internationally. You will share ideas and your passions as you support one another in your efforts to work together on a global stage. Creighton University, anchored in the Jesuit Catholic tradition, understands the mission of the conference well. The School of Medicine strives to improve the human condition. Creighton students spend thousands of hours volunteering, and through Creighton's partnerships with area schools and agencies, fosters academic success, justice before the law, and provides health care for those who might not otherwise get it. We are faculty and students, clinicians, researchers, missioners, activists, and human beings. Together we can work to achieve common goals and live out our missions. I would like to take just a moment to thank and acknowledge the organizations and department that have made this weekend possible. First of all, thanks to the College of Nursing, the Center for Health Policy and Ethics, the School of Medicine, our Peace and Justice Studies at Creighton, Preventative Medicine and Public Health, School of Pharmacy and Health Professions, our Creighton Medical Alumni, our program Masters of Medical Anthropology, the University of Nebraska Medical Center, Creighton University School of Law, and I would like to thank the steering committee for the conference and also our on-campus Sodexo staff and everyone else involved in putting this conference together. You can see the number of people that are involved in pulling this endeavor together, and I hope you have an opportunity to thank some of them along the way. And last, I'd like to thank all of you who are attending and taking part in this multidisciplinary effort. I was privileged at my previous institution to host the Albert Schweitzer Institute. We were home of Dr. Schweitzer's work. And for those of you who are familiar with him, whether as a physician or a humanitarian, his work for reverence of life won a Nobel Peace Prize in 1952. And his dedication to global health issues around the world. So I thought it'd be appropriate to leave you with one of Dr. Schweitzer's quotes as we kick off our Global Health Conference. Dr. Schweitzer is noted for saying, "The purpose of human life is to serve, to show compassion, and the will to help others. I think our conference extends Dr. Schweitzer's message this weekend, and I hope you will all enjoy the conference, enjoy the networking, getting to know each other, and working together as we solve our global health issues. Thank you all, and welcome.
I'm Father Jim Clifton, the Associate Vice Provost for Health Sciences here at Creighton University. And it's my privilege just to provide a brief reflection and a prayer. Of course, we will do that from the tradition that belongs to Creighton University, but with great respect for the faith traditions of all who are present here and of all those across the face of the earth who are really part of this representation here. But before that reflection and prayer, I just want to say that very personally, looking out upon you and knowing of the 400, more than 400 who will be part of this conference over the next day and a half, I am personally very inspired by your dedication and commitment, by your sacrifice of time, by your presence, and have great confidence not only in the future of healthcare, but in the good of our world because of your dedication. So thank you for that. A brief reflection, and beginning with the letter of James in the New Testament, chapter 2, verses 15 to 16. If a brother or sister has nothing to wear and has no food for the day, and you say to them, "Go in peace, keep warm, and eat well," but you do not give them the necessities of the body, what good is it? It's easy to speak eloquently, passionately, even about the dignity, the irreplaceable value of every human life. To speak about those can be easy. But you who have planned and are participating in this Global Health Conference Midwest 2015, you are doing the harder thing. You are putting yourselves at the very frontier of the greatest vulnerabilities of the human family, and with a commitment of heart and mind and a vision toward joining together your individual gifts and talents for the good of all, for the service of those most in need. We will never know the names or the faces of some who will be affected by what happens here this weekend. But this we know: our hearts are big enough, our minds facile enough, our gifts joined together are generous and great enough to touch these most pressing needs of our world. The challenge is enormous, of course, and it's easy to step back and to say, it's just too big an issue. I feel helpless and overwhelmed and powerless. The challenges are great if we think of those affected by these considerations of the next day and a half as other. But the challenge is never too great if we embrace those who suffer as brothers and sisters. And when we remember that ours is a privileged calling to place ourselves at the service of those most in need. And so my prayer tonight is simple. Lord, through all that takes place during this conference, expand the horizons of our minds, stretch the boundaries of our hearts, develop deep and abiding relationships and friendships and colleagueships through the interaction of this wonderful and generous group of people. Help us always to know that joining our gifts together and begging for, counting on your help, we can do all things in you who strengthen us. We pray with the urgency that comes from knowing that countless of our sisters and brothers wait for the help you long to give them through us. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, regardless of your job or current studies, none of us are immune to the influences of a changing and often challenging world. Tonight, however, I am here to introduce you to a woman who has adapted to the constant changes that occur in the field of global health, Dr. Sheila Ryan. Dr. Ryan has focused and dedicated her career to redesigning systems for patient-centeredness and health reform, helping faculty and students expand global opportunities with internet-based education, seeking out quality improvement in healthcare, and discovering innovative health delivery models and global health partnerships. Her nursing partner projects are not only national, but are also international, and include the Shanghai, China, Jordan, schools in Armenia, and the Central Asian republics, and Afghanistan. She is an embodiment of this conference mission by being a catalyst for those who are made vulnerable and seeking out opportunities to not only provide insight into global health issues, but also in facilitating interdisciplinary partnerships. In addition to fostering partnerships internationally, she has also served on a local level by giving 22 years of her life to serve as a nursing dean for 2 universities, and has devoted several decades of her life to attain a BSN, an MSN, and PhD. Tonight, she is here to talk to each and every one of us about her experiences and stories from Asia and the Mideast. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sheila Ryan.
I'm here to share with you some of my journey and some of my lessons learned, not because you need to learn the same lessons, but you will learn your own lessons. And I thought if I shared how my lessons came to me, maybe it would open your experiences both in the past and in the future in global health to be more comfortable about learning and then sharing your lessons. You know, we have a set of tools as health professionals. I refer to it metaphorically as our little black bag. They're usually aimed at diagnosing and treating the individual, and then gradually to the community and gradually to population health. And those are wonderful tools, but I want to emphasize that in my experiences and in my lessons, never before have I learned how so many things contribute and intermingle and are interconnected to health, especially of the population. So to start, just a template, if we all can get on the same page perhaps, I like to borrow from a couple of people's definitions of globalization. Because one of my lessons is that we're in a global world, whether we choose it or not. Globalization exists all around us. We can shut our mind to it if we want, or our eyes to it. But it is ever present. And to me, it's a process that changes us. It changes our interaction. I think it started with the financial world and the economics across countries back in the 90s because of the internet. Oh, global economic markets. And pretty soon there's global everything. And that leads me to my definition, which is the lowering of borders and boundaries and isolation because of sharing, intentional or otherwise. And I want us to think about how many times we build up those borders, or we pretend to build them up, or we don't know we've done it. In professions, in my experience, my career, we used to do a lot of borders and boundaries. Oh no, this is my job, not yours. This is your job, not mine. Oh, we've got to be at the same table to give our best to the client's needs or whatever. But think about the world around us lowering its borders and how that's going to affect our world here before long. I like William Butler Yeats' definition of reducing the ignorance of the whole. Because it is about sharing and information far more than what's in our little black bag. I also think that the focus of most of the global health writings, organizations, WHO, is to escape from poverty by boosting agricultural productivity, improving their health by reducing infections, nutritional deficiencies, and childbirth deaths. and education, particularly for girls, and how the infrastructure impinges on the health of every country. And I hope my stories will reveal that only by telling the stories, as opposed to lecturing you about it. But it is a story of interconnection. I like to borrow from Jeffrey Sachs, who's a professor at Columbia, who's head of their Center for Global Health, Global Strategies, actually, who's on the WHO commission that helped change the shift from WHO strategies from reducing mortality from infectious disease till in 2010 to now improving the health of populations by better managing chronic illness. Something we're trying to figure out how to do as well. And I'll have a presentation tomorrow that's more focused on the shifts of chronic disease by regions at my presentation at 11. I think it's listed as Q&A from this talk, but it isn't. It's a different talk. So I'll try not to focus too much on that. But Jeffrey Sachs has developed and talked a lot about millennial developmental goals. How do we focus on raising the development of countries? And he says we need to put back the focus where it belongs, getting the poorest, as Father and Dr. O'Connor insightfully stated. Getting the poorest what they obviously need: vaccines, antibiotics, food supplements, improved seeds, fertilizer, roads and boreholes and water pipes, textbooks and nurses. And I'm not just here to brag about nurses, but it is a major theme that I've heard in a lot of countries I've been to. And I'll try to explain that a little bit. And he also equates that. Investing in them is not creating dependency and entitlements, but rather it's like an investment, just like his PhD fellowship, and like your scholarships have been. They're investments in you, giving back to the community. A country's developmental status involves several things, and I'm not going to talk about all of these, but as a way to get on the same page. Politics, health and education, nutrition and security, the environment and energy. Even more so in developing countries than we really believe. We think it's a big issue here, but it's more of an issue than we know in developing countries. The social structure, religion, culture, and ethics, and that's a big thing to me anyway, and it's also big in health. We all understand how it plays into health and health treatments. But infrastructure is critical, and certainly war, violence, injury, huge. Just to sort of share with you a lot of data that's available, this shows the per capita change by regions of the world from 1820 to 1998. So in the world, income increased by 9-fold. Africa, 3.5. Asia, even less. They show China here as 6, but in the last 10 years, it's been double-digit growth every year until this year, when it's dropped to 8. And now they're worried, since it's dropped to 8 from double-digit growth, are they going to be able to sustain the recession? Anyway, India, it increased 4-fold. And the point in all of this is look at the United States at the bottom, 22. So we are a country of great wealth and abundance. The last one, though, is interesting to me because Rwanda, since 1998, grew 6 times. Its income grew 6-fold. So there are changes existing around the world, and I think the best part of a global health participation is trying to understand, not just trying to learn, but trying to understand how these things are about. Because you know what? I've learned that they can also help us, and I think they can bring valuable lessons home. I'm not going to touch on this slide, but I love this slide. It's also from Sachs, because it lists the 4 ranges of countries by development, subsistence at the bottom. And it shows what their basic needs are and what their biggest threats are. And of course, innovation economy should be us at the top. Sometimes I think we are a bit of all those in our country because we have some impoverished subsistence economy neighborhoods. But the point is, as an educational system, when you go into a country, you better find out by how you learn about their country which level they really are on. Because we can't give innovation solutions to a country that's on the bottom. So we need to think about understanding them before we even get there, is my point. And again, my notion about borders and boundaries is that, and I like to say, well, microbes don't know borders and boundaries. And we are such a mobile society that we're now learning that, aren't we? We know about SARS, and we know about HB1, and now more recently Ebola. But we also panic when there's an Ebola crisis, even though there's only been about 5 cases treated in the United States, maybe 6. I'm not as current as I probably should be. Only 1 death, and yet we don't pay nearly enough attention to the deaths of flu annually, or whether all the elderly have their vaccination against pneumo. So it helps me to experience the reaction and the feelings and the sentiments and the panic that we get into and figure out why. Where's this coming from? And how do we compare it with other lessons that we're learning at the same time? So I want to share with you a picture. What comes to mind when you see this? Just yell out. What's your first thought that comes to mind? Unsanitary. Yes. Oh my God, germs. What else? What? What? Don't be shy. Meat. It's meat. That's not bad. I think it even might be lamb. I'm not sure. But it was in a Muslim country, so I know it wasn't pork. Okay? Anything else? I think as Americans, that's the first thing we think. Unsanitary. My God, it's hanging fresh outside in the fresh air and bugs and flies and, oh my God, those poor people. And I was talking to some residents and said, why don't you get refrigeration? Oh, why do we need it? What do you mean, why do you need it? Well, we get fresh meat every day. This is slaughtered, killed, and groomed in the morning. So we can get fresh meat every day. And I'm like, they don't get it. If they had refrigeration, they wouldn't have to get fresh meat every day. But then I started thinking, well, what are our trade-offs for having refrigeration? We get meat that's, well, let's see. They eat a lot of corn that's probably has a lot of pesticides, some hormones, and certainly the animals have a lot of antibiotics, I've learned recently when I returned to the farming area, the Midwest, where I live. And I was asking some farmers if we give our cattle more antibiotics or hormones, and they said, hormones quite often, but antibiotics absolutely. I said, why? Because and I was thinking the answer would be it reduces infection or reduces the risk of infection. Oh, no. Antibiotics show that it improves weight gain. So I would like you to think about the trade-offs of, because we have refrigeration and because we have the FDA, how many hands have touched our package of meat that we believe is totally safe because it's been frozen or refrigerated? We have bought into all of that chain of multiple handling, of multiple risks about our meat because we think it's much more modern and safe, safer than the fresh air and fresh meat daily. That's an example of some of the lessons I'd like you to think about when you're doing your global health. I also like to look for similarities rather than differences in the culture. So what do you see here? This is an Afghan man. He has a shop. May not look like it, but that's a shop. Anybody see anything else? Well, you can't really see. But this, pardon me?
Is that a chair?
Yes, that front box and can is a chair. So you can come up to that window and sit on the chair and read the newspaper, if you can read, and have a cup of tea, green tea in Afghanistan. So I looked at that and said, Starbucks. They're equivalents to Starbucks. But in a reaction, whether it's the meat or the Starbucks man, you need to start looking inside yourself. Where's your reaction coming from? And look more deeply at your reaction, because that's how we learn about our culture too. We live our culture, we know our culture. We don't always know it by looking at it closely, though. We just live it. Now, I want to tell you, I've decided to share 4 stories with you tonight. One in Russia, because that started my well, actually it didn't start my career in global health. My very first international global health experience was ILAC in the Dominican Republic while I was here at Creighton. And I didn't know that 6 or 8 years later would begin a whole new venture of a career that has been really a gift to me in my growing career. I want to start with Africa. Now, I said Asia, but Russia. Oh, not Africa. Russia, because that's where my career started. And then I want to move to Armenia. Do you see where Armenia is really south? There's Georgia, Tbilisi, and there's a little country, Armenia. It's east of Turkey. And then I want to take us to Afghanistan, a story about that, and another end with a story about Africa. And then a few slides. So I need to hurry along, because when I tell stories, I'm Irish, and the blarney starts flowing, so I got to sort of pay attention here. Again, my lessons are not necessarily yours, but perhaps as I share them, it will remind you of lessons you've already learned or you can learn. And when I was in the early 90s, do you remember the word perestroika? Some of you are probably too young to know it, but perestroika was the devolution of the USSR. It was the breakup of the Soviet Union into the national countries of Russia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine. Okay, I think there are 11 or 12 countries. And that happened not because Reagan said tear down the wall, but because they were collapsing of their own poor economy. And while our country wanted to support this, they didn't want to show direct aid or give direct aid, because after all, we had been #1 enemies, the USA and USSR, Cold War enemies for something like 30 years or longer. And we were in competition for everything. So we wanted to show aid, our State Department did, and that's when I learned that our State Department is in charge of our foreign policy, and it has 3 arms to itself. It has the embassies to help with moving of our people and other people, and immigration and migration, but it also has aid to developing countries, USAID, where it gives aid directly. And it's attached to our foreign policy, not to our goodwill necessarily. Point I wanted you to hear. And the third thing that is part of the State Department's control for foreign policy is the military. So the military doesn't function totally alone, and it is part of our foreign policy. We tell ourselves it's to protect ourselves and our own freedom all the time, don't we? Anyway, so our State Department wanted to do something positive and supportive of this breakup, but not give direct aid, direct money. So they started this NGO, a non-governmental office in Washington, to help hospital-to-hospital partners. And I was at University of Rochester at the time and participating with Strong Memorial Hospital that became a partner with the KGB Klinika in Moscow. It was where all of the KGB and the higher rep VIPs went for care. And because of that, I was invited to visit and start to learn about the care in Russia. Now, I don't know about you, but the first thing I thought of was Russia was ahead of us in the space race. But in the 60s, because of the space race, late 60s, our health system just rapidly exploded because of what happened to the space race. As a matter of fact, cardiology and EKG started because we started figuring out we could communicate with radial wave signals borrowed from the space race. Also, we learned a lot about respirators and air pressure and how the lungs work in and out of G-gravities and all of this. Pretty soon we had ICUs going like crazy. Then we had Teflon. It was the material that was developed so that the capsule wouldn't burn up coming in. And Teflon became the #1 graft item until we've now gone back to some pigs and so forth. But the whole field of cardiology, vascular surgery, I think of as a direct response to the space race. So I'm thinking, we'll go there and the healthcare system will be like ours. They'll have advanced care systems. I got there and I was pretty surprised. Let me tell you just briefly what it was like. I was toured into the KGB Klinika by the head of cardiology. And I'm like, wow, I'm impressed with myself that they put such a prestigious guy running the tour, right? We must be somebody special. No, we weren't. He was probably picked because they had the coronary care unit had 4 new EKG machines that also allowed them to do the CPR in case the patient crashed. They only had 4 machines, and they were new. And they had then the cameras to monitor them from the nursing station. And this was in like 92, 93. So I'm thinking, wow, I said, so this is very impressive. Do you do bypasses here? Oh, yes, we do bypasses. We do very many. How many did your hospital do last year? And this is like early 90s. He said 17. And I'm like, well, okay, you're getting started. I said, do you do cardiac casts? Oh, yes, we do cardiac casts. Where is that? Where does that happen? So he led me down the hall, and he showed me sort of the dirty utility room. That's where we do them. I'm like, okay. Then he wanted to show us one other thing, which was an incubator sent from the University of Chicago. And the incubator for infants was sort of like on display in a special room. And he obviously wanted to show us their best. And that's when I started noticing what he wasn't saying and what I wasn't seeing. That, first of all, there were no lights on in the hospital. They use electricity in the morning, not during the day, and so this incubator probably would never be used, A, because they don't have electricity around the clock. They shut it off on downtimes. B, they have no system to transport people who need this incubator. They don't do anything to recover low birth weight infants. So it's like, wow, I started seeing a whole different side of a healthcare system, and it was not what I had expected because of how we continued. And to me, that's when I learned that capitalism is good. It's good for society because it spins off businesses all the time. On the other hand, it didn't mean their healthcare was bad. It just meant their resources were really limited and restricted, and no wonder they had a breakup. Now, one other piece of the story is, why did the doctor take us around? And it's because doctors weren't very busy. They didn't have a room full of, waiting room full of patients. There were a lot of rooms that were empty. They didn't have insurance. They didn't have payments. And doctors were hired by hospitals. They're paid by the government, and their salaries weren't all that good. So back to the other question about nurses and doctors. I've learned then that in Asia, Russia, China, India, not India, the communist countries were selective about their graduate programs. They had 3, typically, in almost every place I went. If you wanted to go to graduate school and you were interested in health fields, you went to medical school. They only had 1. If you were interested in dentistry or OT, PT, you went and got your MD. If you were interested in not even business, but any other thing, engineering was the second one. They had big medical schools and engineering schools. And the third one was sort of like cultural religious studies, because there was a lot of religion-based, certainly in the Muslim communities, but not necessarily in Russia. But there were 3 graduate schools, and you didn't get to choose. They chose you which one you would go to. So that's why they had a lot more doctors, and doctors who weren't that busy. So doctors taught nurses in nursing school. They were grateful to get a job teaching nurses. And so to say to them, oh, you need nurses educated at the advanced level to start teaching nurses, is to insult them and to say that they should give up their job that they're grateful to have. So you have to look for the lessons almost subtly, because they're not obvious, and they're not going to tell you. I had a group of nurses come here as part of a people-to-people program, and they came to 5 different cities, and they came to the med center, and we showed them around. I had a group from Moscow also, and I have to embarrassingly cite how the head of this delegation was. She was like really this buxom, proud Russian woman, and she spoke with English with an accent. And so I like to give people textbooks when they come, just as a, just a gesture. No need for English textbooks. We have textbooks. Here's your agenda. No, start before 9. Oh, finish at 4. I'm like, ooh, I got a problem here. So, I ended up saying, well, we're going to start at 7:30 because we got things to do. Please join us here at 9. That's where we'll be. Well, she was there at 7:30. But you could tell she wasn't sure she needed to be here, and she wasn't sure she was going to learn much. And at the end of the week, we all the different 5 cities met in Washington, and we talked about what they learned. They shared what they learned, and she got up and just went on and on and on about all the things she learned here. It shocked me, because I saw her as a closed person, but she opened up incredibly. And when I asked her, which I like to do, what are you going to take home? What are you going to tell the nurses when you get home? I tell them, Americans work very hard. We are behind. And I thought, wow. Here was this really proud confident woman and going home saying, we need to do way more than we've done, if they could, okay? So I look back and I think she wasn't rude at all. She was being her culture. And she was being proud, as many cultures are. Proud of what they have, and they want to show you their very best, usually, if we let them. And it may not be what we wanted to see, or it may not be what we think is the best, but it is their best, and they want to show off their best. While I was working with AIHA, one of the things we did is there was a group that started a National Institute for Nursing Leadership because they felt they had to really invest in the nurses. And I was appointed to the board after 4 or 5 years, and as the board member, I was invited to this nursing meeting in Tbilisi, Georgia, and to give comments for AIHA, which was funding the organization or the meeting. But I was the one who learned the most. First of all, I was the only English speaker. All of the speakers were from various parts of the nursing community throughout Russia and the other nations. And it was in this KGB resort house, which was up on the mountains in Tbilisi, Georgia. It was cold, there wasn't heat. They used the petroleum oil to shine up the marble floor so it smelled like petroleum. I'll never forget that. But they were so focused on this meeting because as nurses they had never traveled before to a meeting. The doctors went to meetings, never nurses. And as nurses they had never presented or heard nurses present before, and they had never presented themselves before. And one of my colleagues from AIHA taught me a lot. She worked with every single one of their presentations, and she put PowerPoints together, and she did English and Russian so they could all speak in Russian even though they were from different countries. And she told them how to dress and how to present and how to speak. And you'd think they were being awarded the Nobel Prize when they got up to talk. It made me realize I was sort of at the birthing of a profession. The first time ever they got to speak with other nurses and go to a meeting. I was really touched. And I've followed a lot of them. And there's a lot of leadership that has come out of that institute as a consequence. But one of the people in the room, I remember asking, anybody interested in doing a master's program? One person stuck her hand up and waved. Yes, I want to do a master's program for nurses. I said, what would you do it in? And she said, community, because we don't have any community systems. And it's true. Most of the countries don't have community health. They have very poor, if any, mental health or population health. So, and public health is also not something that they had. They had statistics, but not much. Okay, so when I got to UNMC in the early 2000s, I discovered that 80 of the courses at the master's level were mostly online. There were some face-to-face, but even out in the state, we would use video and mail it to them, actually. So I said, wow, if we can do it outside, why don't we do it to Armenia? That was the school that wanted to do a community health. So I got some money from the organization to pay for the tuition in order to get some students who were junior faculty, the first ones ever with a bachelor's degree, who are now teaching, to agree to take 5 graduate courses. And at the time, the organization didn't want to fully complete their master's because they would leave. If you get a master's, they leave, and it's a ticket to the United States, Great Britain, Canada, where the pay is great, they can send money home and support 3 families. So I was just happy to do anything they would pay for to get it started. And so I sent a colleague of mine over there to help explain how to get onto Blackboard, you know, that college template. And she came back and said, it's not going to work. What do you mean it's not going to work? Well, they don't speak English. They say they speak English. They also said they have computers. She says they don't have computers. They say they have internet access to computers. And they say they know English. She says, well, they don't. So this is a lesson about language. What I learned is they don't speak English, but they read it very well. They studied all Russian, former Soviet countries included, study English up through junior high. Then if you're going to go to an international professional program, you're selected for an English immersion, where that's when you start learning to speak it somewhat. And of course, nurses were way at the bottom of that, so they didn't get any of the exposure. So I said, well, they said they did, and so we're going to go ahead. And I was the first class. My graduate class was the first class in health systems. So here they are, 5 students in Yerevan, Armenia, joining my group of 60 graduate students. And they were really going along quite well. I assigned them to groups. They had to do projects. They had to come into class every week. And we only had 5 or 6, online. Now we do it online computer, but at the time it was video cassette, and we mailed it to them. Well, Thanksgiving came along, and they disappeared. They suddenly disappeared. So I called the funder, and I said, oh, man, Ellen was right. It's not going to work. But they were learning English. Their English was getting better all the time, and they were engaging. And he says, all right, I'm going to pay for them to come to Omaha for a week, all 5 of them. I want them to see the college. I want them to see the hospital. I want them to see nurses in action. And you'll learn why. That's the only time you'll learn what happened to them. Okay, which is, I thought, great. Met them at the airport, gave them all a hug. They're all in their early 20s. And before I even got to the car with them, they said, our electricity is shut off, and so our dean was too proud to tell you. It was the first thing out of the mouth of one of them. And I said, oh, she says, our electricity is attached to the hospital, and we run out of electricity as the year ends, and so the hospital has to have it, and so they close us early. Okay, that explains it. But I enjoyed, more than anything else, helping them see nursing as we live it, not just as we teach it. And I enjoyed every day asking them what surprised them today. So I asked them what surprised them about their class, and they said, you have group learning. Yeah. She says, I said, what exactly do you mean? You assign an article, and you ask everybody else to tell what was in the article, and everybody tells something different. I said, yeah. She said, well, then I said, what would it be like in your country? Oh, we read the article and learn what it is the leader wants us to know from the article. And I said, well, we have some of that here. But they said, but everybody learns more. Aha. I said, now you know. You've seen that. Then they said, we're going to go back right away, and so we've started using it already with our students. I also was embarrassed to show them around to our hospital because we had just redone the birthing center, and one of them was interested in maternity, taught maternity. And I'm like, I wanted to show off this beautiful unit. At the same time, I was kind of embarrassed that it was so rich, like Hilton Presidential Suite or something. And so I showed them around, and they nodded, they looked, they, talked to the nurses. And at the end of that day, I said, what did you learn about your visit in the hospital? What surprised you most about nurses? What, if anything, you could take home to change? What would it be? And she said, the autonomy of your nurses. You make decisions for patients. And you act in their best interest. And I said, that's perfect. And I was the one worried about, the carpet and the nice mahogany tops of the dresser or whatever. But they didn't see that at all. They don't see the things that sometimes we judge as part of our success measure. And she was right on target with what makes a professional, is the autonomy of your decision ability. I think it's important to always ask, what have you learned today? And I also like to ask them, I use the example about the group learning and the leader from saying, yeah, well, this is democracy. This is democracy of thinking. Everybody gets to think what they want when they read something. And so I kept using examples of this is how democracy is, because not that they're going to run home and change democracy, but they have a view of what it is, and they haven't had it much as a communist country. But I also learned from a group that came from Afghanistan, what do you think, and you've been here a couple of weeks, what do you think democracy is? How do you see it? And he says, in your country, if you speed, everybody gets a ticket. And of course, I have a lead foot. I'm notorious for my lead foot, and I thought interesting that he should use that as an example. But I said, how is it in your country? Oh, if you are an important person, never You would never have to pay for a ticket. They would never give you a ticket. You would be in trouble if you gave them a ticket. I said, well, we have some of that here. But democracy is a day-to-day thing. And by the way, the end of that story of Armenia is I am now helping the 3rd International Congress for Nursing Leadership held in Yerevan that this young group of faculty and their dean are putting on for all the regions in the Eastern Europe area. And it is sophisticated. It's not quite as nice as this meeting here today, but they are organized. They have 2 sets of slides in English and in Russian. And the meeting I first went to, they had about 14 plenaries and 70 breakout sessions. I was blown away. And it just keeps growing. And of the 5 that first came, one is finishing her PhD in public health. The other is the head nurse of a children's hospital. And the other one is in charge of all the technical learning programs out of the school that I originally visited. And we didn't even complete 5 courses. And we didn't complete it because, guess what? Suddenly, USAID decided, they announced literally one day, no more money for the Caucasus region. Why? And we started fussing, and that means we had to close offices in all these different parts of the region. Not me, but AIHA. Well, it seems apparent that at that time, it was in 2005, we're going to be going, or maybe it was 2003, we're going to be going to war. And they wanted to use the money from that to build runways in Uzbekistan. And so we knew pretty well, Uzbekistan, you could go to war in Iraq, or you could go to war in Afghanistan. So that's one of the problems of having USAID. It's also the foreign policy that can change just like that. So sustainability is always an issue in healthcare programs. But it also leads me now, segue, to my next issue, and that is Afghanistan. I was there in 2003. Why? Because one of our directors of cardiology in UNMC was a friend of one of the military medical doctors in Baghdad. And he called him and said, we need help desperately. Can you help us? Well, what do you mean? What do you need? Well, we've got the most, this is in Iraq now, we've got the most advanced technical ICU unit equipment sitting outside 30 tents around the country, nobody to put them together and nobody that knows how to use them. So what that required then is, do we send a bunch of people in? And ultimately it means we need to educate them, try to build their capacity as opposed to run in and fix things. So we explored building the capacity. How do we do that? Word came to me and I said, well, is it safe to go into Iraq? And he said, oh, not a problem. We'll be traveling around in Black Hawks all the time. This is about 3 months or so before the Black Hawk Down incident. I wasn't so impressed with the military Black Hawk helicopters. So I said, well, what more than that, before I get other faculty involved, because I'm not an ICU nurse, I said, what about our benefits of the university? Something happened to me, will they honor all those benefits? Oh no, if it's a war zone, they don't honor any of the benefits. So it's like, okay, that's my answer. But I did start looking in Jordan, next door, because I also had just read Queen Noor's book. And Jordan was a very westernized community next door. I thought, okay, so we'll go to Jordan, we'll do some professional education, get the nurses there. How am I doing on time, guys? I'm close to wrapping it up. So I'll go next door, and the head Iraqi doctor said, oh, no, we are not sending anybody to Jordan. Why is that? I'm thinking, I'm creating a political incident here. Because Iranian doctors are far more educated than Jordanian doctors. I'm like, oh, ego. But I knew it wouldn't work. So I said, okay, I'll have to come up with some other strategy. We never did come up with a strategy to help the Army in their ICUs, as a matter of fact. But it did lead us to Afghanistan. And my story in Afghanistan is a little smaller, and it's a little more focused, and it's a negative story about America, because I want to balance it out a little bit. Going in and out of Kabul the first time was an incredible feat. You had to you had to meet in Dubai, and because they didn't even have instrumentation in the towers in Kabul set in this bowl in the mountains, the Hindu Kush mountains, They had to call every morning at 6 to see what the weather was going to be like, to see if we would have visibility to land, because we couldn't land if there wasn't visibility. Whoa. So we would go, for 3 or 4 mornings, we'd go to the airport every morning at 6 and wait for a clear day, I guess. It was only about 3 or 4 hours flight. But when I sat there in the waiting room of this flight into Kabul, I learned a lot about all the other people sitting there. There was a team from Britain who were finance people, and they were obviously putting their presentation together on how they could be helpful in the financing and developing more financial models. There was a group from Denmark also showing, and I looked at their PowerPoint presentation. It was on growing wheat in the desert. And I thought, well, we could do some of this from our ranchers in southwest, or southwest Nebraska. There's similar climates. Okay, so anyway, we got in there, and I was shocked to see how poor the conditions were, because it was war-torn for 20 to 30 years. We went to the hospital, and it was even more shocking. It was back another 50 years before the ones that I'd seen in Moscow, in Armenia. I'll give you a quick example. A doctor, I was being toured around. I had a winter coat on because there was no heat. I was being toured around. They showed me where the operating suite was. And this surgeon comes out of his operating room and says, because he obviously knew I was an American, come in, come in. He wanted to pull me into his OR suite. And I'm in a coat. So they said, no, no, put some things on. And they put a gown over me, and I stepped in some like big rubber boots. And I walked in, and he wanted to show me that what he needed more than anything else was an anesthesia machine, because they were giving ether by drip, which we did a long time ago. And what I saw was really more powerful than the anesthesia machine. I saw that the patient was lying there, sedated now, had a gown, patient gown over her, but her street clothes were on underneath her. And they were going to do an abdominal surgery, an appendectomy on her. I saw the circulating nurse, also with a gown on and her street clothes. She was in high heels and had long fingernail polish. And I'm like, oh my God, this wouldn't go in our country. And plus, I'm in there, you know, bringing the crowds along. And I started to realize to teach principles of sterile asepsis would sort of be wasted. It's like, God, where do you start? But we did go back 6 years later on a project. We were one of 3 universities doing a project to help improve health care. Our job was to focus on clinical instruction. And we thought we'd use simulation and bring in some modules that we could sort of transpose in their system. But we ended up not doing much because the director of this NGO was really less than a savory character, how shall I say. He was much more interested in the fact that he had Toyota 4Runners that were all armor-plated and that he had armed guards moving us around Kabul because it was a dangerous area. Now, he didn't care much at all about our project. And it's like he had $6 million, of which went maybe $1 million each to the 3 universities. One was doing education, we were doing clinical instruction. And the other one was going to start a public health program. It was a year-long program, not very long. And so we were trying, we were out there meeting people. And he was just freaking out about needing to coordinate our trips across town. Now, UNO is known for its Afghan studies. It's one of the few places in the United States that's light years ahead. We have a big group of Afghanis here in Omaha. They have a UNO House of Afghan Studies. In Kabul, we wanted to stay there. I'd stayed there the first time. If I'd stayed there, the food is good, the transportation is easy, and you don't need an armored guard because you're with the locals. And it turns out that shortly after that trip, when I was not getting along so well with the project director, because he wasn't concerned at all about helping us with our program, they got another award. And by the way, this agency had a $100 million book of business in Afghan alone that year, every year. Big bucks of money going in to support the culture. So a lot of the reason that they were putting up with us, even though we were arrogant and stupid, they were putting up with us because there was money flowing into their culture. So we get another $12 million project to our project, a boost. I don't know how. We weren't invited to participate in any projects yet. And not one dime of it went into the program. It went into building a new compound for all the staff. And I thought it was really abuse of American dollars. And I just want Americans to hear that sometimes our ugly American face comes with government dollars, and I don't even think our government knows it. But here's Karzai, whose family has lived in Lincoln for a long time, Lincoln, Nebraska. He's very connected to the UNO Afghan Studies. And here he is trying to represent a people that sees graft and corruption from Americans, who sees even the UN driving around in their forerunners all over town, and they'll tell you right away, they haven't done a thing since they've been here. So it's really, my advice is don't be impressed with all the superstructures of the aid that comes in, but get to the level of the structure of the people. That's when you get the true story, and they don't mind sharing it to you, sharing it with you. I wanted to come home and immediately pick up the phone and call Hillary Clinton, who was the State Department director, and say, no wonder you have a problem with Karzai. And I also know it's a Midwestern value that I better check with my dean before I do this. And the dean said, no way, you're not going to rock those boats. That's a Midwestern value. You know, I was in the East for a while, and people loved rock boats there. So you do have to be representing your institution. So I didn't call, but I was thrilled about a year later when I heard this whole NGO was closed. And I was pleased to hear it was closed. So we're not always doing the do-gooders. I mean, we do a lot of good, but there are a lot of other countries doing a lot of good. And one of the best things I learned in visiting Kabul was every morning at the hotel, we would go down for breakfast, and there would be Canadians working on the banking infrastructure, and there were some Americans working for a German NGO that were working on health policy and public health, and there was a woman engineer from Ecuador, and she was fixing the surges of their water power that took their internet and electricity up and down, and they were fixing things. And it was just the coolest international cadre of colleagues. And it really reflects also how health has to change. It takes all of those things working together. And I think if I ever did anything for Afghan, it was at those breakfast meetings trying to convince the health policy guy from the German NGO that he's got to get some health policy outreach models going, especially for women's care, because they have and still have, I think, the highest mortality, maternal mortality rate. And a lot of it is because they're living out in those mountains. Okay, I'm about to close here with one last story, and it's about AIDS in Africa. In 2003, Bush was convinced to put, I think, 15, maybe billion, I don't know, million, I can't remember, probably billion, into the budget for AIDS treatment. And it's because there was really embarrassment that we had treatment, and 80% of those with AIDS in Africa and 80% of the deaths were all from Africa. So 80% of the AIDS population and death, mortality rate. People were not getting tested. And so it was Clinton and Bill Gates who convinced Bush to jointly, they put their resources together and said, let's set a goal of 10% of the population getting treatment. So then let other population know that maybe they're not going to die from it, so that they'll be encouraged to get tests. It's a great idea. They convinced him into it, and so there was a lot of activity. The first problem they had to deal with is, do we use American pharmaceuticals or Indian pharmaceuticals? And a lot of the drugs are the same. I know there are some pharmacy folks here may take me on about that, but anyway, and it has to do with supply and financing. And then the next question was distribution. Anybody that can reach out and help people take these meds are not easy to take, and a lot of them don't know how to read the instructions. So there needed to be a partner buddy, and they used the model that Paul Farmer used in Peru with TB treatment without community workers. And then pretty soon they realized people's lives were being saved, but the rate of testing was not going up. So they did not know what was going on. In 2011, I was at a meeting in Johannesburg, and for entertainment of all of this guests, we were at the University of Witwatersrand, there was a local troupe who did acting in the schools about AIDS prevention. And they were our entertainment for the evening, barbecue or whatever it was. And that's when I learned why it wasn't working. They showed 2 or 3 acts of what's typical. And The husband, who has a job, is usually driving a truck or driving away. He's out of the town. And the wife is managing the kids, and she's afraid she has AIDS, that he's probably given it to her. Their nieces, a 14-year-old niece, is living with them because her mother died, the wife's sister. And the father is probably, when he's drinking a lot and coming home, also giving AIDS to the niece. And the mother doesn't know how to get a handle on this. So she suggests that they get testing, and she gets beaten up. Because how dare she suggest that he has AIDS, as she's probably sleeping around on him. And so that is the cycle that they told me happens over and over and over again in most of the homes. So I want to end with, well, I'm not quite done, but the end of this story is that I heard the former director, the medical director of WHO for all of healthcare programs in Africa, say the #1 health intervention for AIDS in Africa is to educate women. I couldn't believe it. I thought I'd never hear that. He says, unless we educate and empower women, this whole system is not going to change. So all of our toolboxes and our techniques may be for naught if we don't get to understand the culture better. So, so that, I hope, helps you understand that sometimes there are too many doctors and not enough nurses, but it's a function of their educational system and their limited resources. Sometimes we all need more community and home-based services and more standards in education. When they all broke away from Moscow, by the way, most of them hated Moscow because all they did is direct them for years and years. And they wanted to do everything with their own national identity, including a nursing curriculum for Uzbekistan, different than others. And so I went in and consulted to try and get them to have a common standard. There's a change in our USAID operating frame, and it happened just recently with Hillary was at the State Department. Instead of just doing one disease, one country at a time, which was the model that USAID used for 50 years, it now says, if you're going to get USAID work and money, you have to have at least half of these addressed in your proposals. I'm not going to go through them, but they sort of address different things that we talked about. And I like to use the Clinton Global Initiatives in sort of focusing on the outcomes. He says of those many things that are interacting, we really need to work on 5. Again, I don't need to read those to you. But it is women's education. And this was one of the first pictures we saw. They toured us in Afghanistan immediately after the Taliban left, because the Taliban does not want women educated. And frankly, the new sheikh in Saudi Arabia, everybody's guessing, will he open up the opportunities for women? And they say he has a health condition. Has that been reported in our local papers? The new sheikh has a health condition. Guess what it is? Dementia. Anyway,
Oops.
This is what we do in global health. We try to share. We don't necessarily go in and fix all the diseases, but we do share our wealth, our ideas, our information. And trust, because I think that the root of all of it is relationships, relationships, relationships. All the products are built on that. And you'll go at the speed they want to go at, not the speed we go at, because we're drivers and productive and movers and shakers. Wang Bo is an old Tang Dynasty poet who says, "A bosom friend afar brings a distant land near." And I think for the United States culture, we need to bring far more distant lands near. We have a lot in our country. We sort of don't bring them very near. And I think in keeping with the social justice of the earlier prayer and the Jesuit tradition, I can't leave without concluding with Martin Luther King's comments, because I think it reflects also our work in global health. True peace is not the absence of tension. It's the presence of justice. And injustice anywhere is a threat to injustice everywhere. We are tied in a single garment of destiny. Thank you. Thank you.